Good evening, or whatever time of the day it is, wherever you are in the world, because the Bristol Festival of Ideas, in the age of Zoom and Crowdcast, is going online, and we're continuing to get a great program of speakers, and our audience can be international. Perhaps we're now the Bristol International Festival of Ideas. You can follow us from our webpage on Twitter, sign up to our newsletter. Today, I'm delighted to be able to take part in this conversation with Kate Manne, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Cornell University and the author of the award-winning Down Girl, recently named one of the world's top 10 thinkers by Prospect magazine, and certainly has had a massive impact with her work. And you can buy the book, by the way. Let me just give you a talk around the interface for people who aren't familiar. There's a link to buy a copy of the book from our partners at Waterstones at the bottom of the page. There'll also be a link in the chat function. If you want to ask a question, there's an Ask a Question tab. And if you just pop your question in there, you can also upvote questions. If you see someone else has posed a really good question, there's some way of pushing it up the list so that it gets more to my attention. And we'll take questions certainly at the end, but maybe even as we go. But anyway, let me introduce Kate. We've already introduced her briefly, but hello, Kate. Thank you for coming virtually to Bristol.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be in conversation. And yeah, thanks so much for doing this, Julian.
So this is the book entitled Why Male Privilege Hurts Women. And I just wanted to begin, Kate, by asking you about this, because obviously there's been a lot of writing about misogyny, sexism, women's rights, the fight for female equality over the years. But this question of entitlement, it seems like something that hasn't got as much attention as anything else. What made you think that this was a subject which required some new attention, and why was it important?
Yeah, great question. So I wrote my first book, Down Girl, largely with the aim of defining the concept of misogyny. And in a nutshell, what I say is that misogyny is, metaphorically speaking, the law enforcement branch of patriarchy. It's a system that functions to police and enforce a patriarchal order by visiting women with hostility and hatred, paradigmatically when they violate norms and expectations inherent to patriarchy. And that left me with this question, well, what are these norms and expectations of patriarchy, especially in relatively egalitarian contexts like the US and the UK today? And my answer to that, in brief, is male entitlement. That there's a system that functions such that privileged men, at least, are deemed entitled to certain goods, and women are deemed obligated, on the flip side, to provide privileged men with those goods. And that, I think, when women fail to do that, or are perceived as failing to do that, that's what leads to misogynistic punishment, fallout, reprisal.
Okay, but actually, because you brought it up now, let's make those differences between misogyny and sexism then. Mm-hmm. I think you do draw that distinction. I think that's quite important for how we address this socially. So how do you distinguish misogyny from sexism?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one way of thinking about it very pithily is to think about sexism as the kind of the bad beliefs, the bad ideology that functions to uphold patriarchy. And misogyny is the kind of the bad desires and the enforcement of the patriarchal status quo. So sexism is a system that kind of functions to naturalize and rationalize a gendered division of labor and men's dominance in traditionally male-dominated areas like business, politics, even academia, to set up bad ideas. Whereas misogyny is, I think, the active branch of this enforcement system. It's what actually kicks in to put women back in their place if they show signs of deviating from it. And sexism says, well, they won't be very good in roles where they deviate from the status quo. Misogyny forces them back into that role or tells them to stay in their lane.
But one of the interesting things about once you introduce that distinction is that it allows the possibility that someone can behave misogynistically without mm-hmm. actually holding sexist beliefs.
Right.
How then, so when you're addressing misogyny, it's not then enough, or sometimes perhaps it's even the wrong strategy to mm-hmm. attribute to someone's sexist beliefs. That complicates matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, I love that question because I think it vastly complicates a strategy that has very commonly and understandably been employed to combat problematic gender non-savvy views and actions. So people sometimes think, well, it must be a matter of bad beliefs or negative stereotypes about women. And if we just give people more information that women are actually excellent at doing male-dominated things, then all will be well. And my view suggests that that's not the case, that as well as the belief that women just aren't very good at certain things, there's the desire that they not be very good at certain things and outstanding in other areas like traditionally feminine coded duties like caregiving. So yeah, you can do away with the bad beliefs and still have the bad desires to keep women in their place.
Yeah, because you say in the book that misogyny is primarily a property of the social environment, social environments, in fact, not beliefs per se. And now let's just turn this to this issue of entitlement. I mean, the book covers lots of different kinds of entitlement, and some of them perhaps are more intuitively clear to others. So if I say that, you know, as you argue that, by the way, one thing I have to avoid in this thing is me mansplaining. We'll come to mansplaining. There's this terrible danger that I'm going to
mansplain. You know.
Yeah,
I'll
I'm going to
know.
mansplain to you, you know, what you said. But I just tried to set up forms of entitlement, such as the entitlement to sex. So perhaps we can recognise the fact that yes, a lot of men go around sort of as though the world owes them sex, power, admiration, and domestic labour. I guess these are things which you talk about in interesting and new ways, but they're fundamentally quite familiar. But can we say a couple of things about other forms of entitlement that maybe aren't so well thought about? What about, for example, entitlement to medical care? I mean, that's not something that I think leaps out at people as a product of this misogynistic society. How does that manifest itself?
Yeah, and that's an important difference. So in the book, I'm really talking about two different ways in which entitlement is problematic. One is where there's a pervasive sense of male entitlement that deems men more entitled to certain goods than is proper, or deems women obligated to provide them with these goods. And there's also, I think, a pernicious phenomenon of women being denied what they're actually entitled to, where men are actually getting, generally speaking, or at least privileged men are getting what they do deserve and are owed, such as medical care, whereas women tend to be shortchanged in this system. So there's two possibilities. One is that in the first case, we have this system where men in a way need to be more like women and deemed less entitled, have less of a sense of entitlement perhaps. And then there's this other possibility that pertains to the issue of medical care, where women need to be deemed more entitled to these basic human goods.
Okay, so I mean, there are some specific examples of how this sort of manifests itself, aren't there? I think, for example, the way in which medicines and treatments are actually developed, which again, I think we kind of naively assume this is just objective science, right? Investigating illnesses and so forth.
Right.
But it isn't like that, right?
Right. So Caroline Criado Perez, in her excellent book Invisible Women, has a very useful notion of an androcentric medical model where a male body, and I should say a cis male heterosexual non-disabled male body, is treated as the default patient, the default recipient of care, such that women and many other marginalized bodies are not treated as the kind of primary subject of this kind of care and attention, and their medical problems, especially if they're distinctively affecting, say, women, they tend to be neglected within medical research.
Yeah, so it's all tested on men, and then perhaps the dosages, for example. I mean, a straightforward thing like dosage doesn't apply, as well as the fact that there are important, often biological differences. But then also the way in which patients are treated when they go to medical professionals with their symptoms. I mean, you say that people aren't treated, they're not treated as though they're entitled to the same degree of almost credibility sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a long and really tragic history of women, especially women of color, especially Black women in the US at least, being treated as hysterical, as incompetent, even as malingerers. And that has enormous consequences. We see, for example, in the US, Black women's mortality rates for pregnancy and during and after childbirth are 3 to 4 times that of white women. And that is a fact that should shock the conscience and desperately needs rectification. And writers like Tressie McMillan Cottom have traced that to treating Black women like her as fundamentally incompetent about their own medical needs, their pain, their suffering, and other symptoms they may be experiencing.
And also a lot of this is dismissed as somehow being that because women are seen as being hysterical, they're more likely to have their symptoms attributed to psychosomatic reasons rather than purely physical ones. And
yeah, no, exactly.
And going back to the thing about this being systemic and not being about sexist beliefs, female doctors are often, or as much or just often, doing these same kind of mistakes when they're coming across female patients.
Yeah, unfortunately, with most of these biases, and this applies across the board, we see that women have internalized them almost as much or as much as men. And so it tends not to make an enormous difference if you're talking about a male or female doctor. I don't mean, by the way, to exclude non-binary doctors. There just isn't data that I'm aware of regarding them. But similarly, when it comes to voting preferences, we don't see huge reductions in bias. In fact, we see almost no reduction in bias when we compare a female voter to a male counterpart.
Right. So, I mean, this again is quite troubling, isn't it? Perhaps we'll come to some solutions later. But just one more area of entitlement, which I think most people will find this one where they'll see the chapter heading and perhaps won't know what to expect at all, and that's entitlement to knowledge. Mm-hmm. So, how is the entitlement to knowledge operating, working against women?
Yeah, so what I do in that chapter is I distinguish a sense of entitlement to be the designated knower, the interlocutor, the person who issues authoritative explanations within a conversation, and also a person who controls the narrative. And I trace that sense of entitlement to mansplaining on the one hand, but also gaslighting on the other, which I think often emanates from a sense that someone who isn't necessarily male, but is most likely disproportionately male, is entitled to control the topics that get discussed and what information gets shared, and to shut down discourse or particularly challenges that aren't welcome.
I mean, you mentioned the term mansplaining earlier, and you used it there. So actually, there's a nice little lexicon, which is partly words of your own coinage, partly ones that you've borrowed and used. And it's quite useful to have this lexicon in some ways, although I'll perhaps come to some problems with it in a minute. But for those not familiar with mansplaining, could you explain what that is?
Yeah, so I don't try to define mansplaining in this chapter of the book, but I give a sort of paradigm case, which is a man explaining or attempting to explain something, usually incorrectly, to a more expert female speaker or set of speakers. And often it also involves him kind of arrogantly holding forth, even when in the original case Rebecca Solnit discusses, even when he's corrected and brought up short and informed she's actually the expert who's written the book on the subject under discussion, he'll keep holding forth. And so a mansplainer is often almost uninterruptible.
yeah. It makes me when I read about that, makes it very nervous. Anyone who's like me, a bit of a chatterbox, I kind of do worry that I might slip into that as well. Another term you come up, I think this is your coinage, himpathy.
Right.
What is sympathy?
Himpathy is the disproportionate or undue sympathy, sometimes extended to privileged men, over their similarly or less privileged female victims in cases of things like domestic violence, sexual violence, and other forms of misogynistic abuse. Okay,
so for example, could you give us an example of that perhaps? There have been some recently.
Right. So I think a topical example of that would be Jeffrey Toobin exposing himself, masturbating on a Zoom call with colleagues, and there being more concern for him and the loss of his reputation rather than what he did that was harmful towards his colleagues, particularly colleagues who might be vulnerable and sensitive to that kind of reckless display.
Mm. I mean, I think you make the case entirely persuasively that, you know, when you have that disproportionate concern is entirely unjustifiable. But I think where I like to sort of explore, but I think where it gets tricky is how much, you know, that excessive concern is one thing, but there's also understanding the context. And I think that given your analysis of misogyny, it seems very clear that this is really a product of our culture. And that makes the attribution of individual responsibility a bit more problematic, doesn't it? So if I can give an example, I mean, I grew up, right, on 70s heavy rock. And if you read the lyrics of any of these things, I mean, they're absolutely dreadful, actually. I mean, a lot of them are advocating some of them are pretty much advocating rape straight out. Often they're paedophilia and everything. Underage girls are a common trope of 70s heavy rock. And, you know, and you grow up in a culture in which the kind of awful expectations and entitlements that you catalogue in this book are, for the boy growing up in the culture, really absolutely normal. So in that kind of situation, inappropriate though it is to have more sympathy for the man than the victim, how do we sort of nevertheless sort of have the appropriate degree of understanding for why that individual male is behaving in this awful way?
I think we can definitely understand that, I mean, all of us are embedded in a misogynistic social system. And I think that none of us, I mean, certainly not me, are immune from inadvertently perpetuating misogynistic social mores. You know, it's very difficult when it's the water that we swim in to emerge dry. But that being said, I think an understanding of that still permits us to hold individuals accountable, especially when, yes, they grew up in this culture, but they're now adults. I suppose I have pretty stock standard views, and, you know, this is of course an area of great philosophical controversy, but I have pretty standard views about our ability to hold cognizant adults responsible for their participation in or complicity with harmful and racist social practices. So for example, yes, someone can grow up listening to rock music lyrics that are problematic. They're still responsible as an adult for not committing pedophilia. I mean, I think that's obvious.
Yeah, I think absolutely, I can see that's obvious. But I think what's interesting is the traditional kind of liberal position on wrongdoers has generally been to be quite understanding and tolerant. So, for example, I mean, we know that a lot of people who are abusers, for example, were themselves abused as children. We know that most sort of juvenile knife crime is by people who are growing up in chaotic environments where there's no control and so forth. And traditionally, the liberal-minded person has tended to sort of encourage that kind of understanding, with it not certainly not condoning, not accepting, but kind of understanding in ways which actually tend to rile people on the right who talk about excuses and so forth. And I'm just wondering whether or not, you know, you think what you're advocating in terms of misogyny is aligned with that, or whether that or are there perhaps good reasons why we should be more understanding in those kind of cases than we should be in these?
Yeah, I would draw a strict distinction between understanding as in comprehending a crime or a bad act versus sympathizing with the person who did it, which involves giving moral attention and care and concern and kind of directing warm moral feelings in that direction. So I think we can understand what's going on. We certainly don't want to dismiss people as monsters, because these aren't monsters. They very much walk amongst us. You know, rapists are not monsters because that exonerates by caricature. That's always been my feeling about this, that we need to recognize that rapists, among other people, aren't monsters. They're ordinary people who do dastardly things that deserve to be condemned. I would say, though, that there is nuance that's needed here. There's often been a desire to believe that, for example, abusers were generally abused as children. And that's just not true, actually. It's a very common belief, but the mistake was made because of not observing baseline rates. So a lot of therapists would observe that abusers were often abused. But the sad thing is everyone, people in general, are often abused. And it turns out that being abused doesn't raise the probability that someone will go on to be an abuser above the baseline rate. So that's an interesting fact, as is the fact that sexual abuse and misogynistic abuse in particular isn't exclusively perpetrated by men, but it's close to exclusively in certain areas, such as strangulation. And so we want to be very careful with some of these potentially exonerating, and I agree, standard liberal narratives, because in fact, it turns out that they're probabilistically dubious, and also that they tend to miss the fact that many, many people suffer terrible forms of abuse and rarely go on to abuse themselves, namely women and girls.
Okay, that's really very, very interesting indeed. One of the, I said earlier I had some reservations about some of these terms. I think terms like mansplaining and empathy, I think they make perfect sense. Do you have any concern though that sometimes they could turn into like conversation stoppers? In other words, as a man, sort of, if I'm criticized and I try to defend myself, someone can say, "Oh, you're mansplaining," and they may be right, but they may be wrong. And if they're wrong, it's sort of difficult to fight that. Similarly, around perhaps. I mean, perhaps we'll come later to the ideas of transphobia is a more specific one. I think we need to take that as a separate thing. And empathy as well. I mean, I guess I fully get what you're saying about it, and I buy your argument. There might be concern. I mean, for example, you are a bit critical of Sarah Silverman in your book, who you say is expressing inappropriate empathy. Whatever the merits of that case, the risk is that whenever somebody tries to kind of explain things, it's sort of like somehow provide some background understanding so that people don't demonize the person. That's empathy, that's mansplaining. Now, I just want to make it quite clear. It's obviously not a criticism of those concepts, or they can be abused in that way. But do you think that is a danger with these kind of terms? They become conversation stoppers, ways of labeling people as being in the wrong camp, end of story.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd say a couple of things. I think they're terms that can obviously be used improperly, and that puts them on all fours with every term in the English language. So all terms can be misused. I take it, that's just an entailment from having a correct usage. And also most moral terms, in as much as they carry moral weight and heft, can be weaponized in ways that are problematic. And I tend to think that's not a strike against the term or a problem with the practice. It's just to say, well, you have to use morally weighty terms carefully. I think that, by the way, too, about the concept of being a misogynist. So I define being a misogynist as a threshold term that you have to be perpetuating and contributing a lot to a misogynistic social environment to count as a misogynist. That label is only appropriate when it's a kind of full-blown character assessment, when you're an overachiever in the misogyny system, if you like, to put it, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I guess one thing, though, I would say is that I think these terms can be properly used as conversation stoppers, and that can be really valuable. Right. So one of the things they're designed to do is remember the description of mansplaining I gave as the kind of relentless flow of a man's pontificating. And to identify the phenomenon, to diagnose the problem, can absolutely shut things down. And that can make space for hitherto marginalized people, including but not limited to women, to speak up. So it can be a conversation stopper in exactly the right direction. It can shut down someone who's said enough. I think similarly with empathy, obviously people can misapply the term. I'm sure I'm not perfect in my usage of the term. It would be kind of amazing if someone like me wasn't, slightly prone to overly diagnose empathy given what I work on. It's kind of a professional hazard. But I actually think it's good to have some people like me who are very sensitized to the phenomenon, because if it exists, then we can point it out and be quite reliable. We can be quite sensitive, although not necessarily completely reliable in every time we point it out it being the case. So, you know, for those of you who've read your nose, you can be kind of a sensitive without being super safe detector. And in an epistemic community, I think that can have a valuable role to play in making us appropriately sensitized to some phenomenon that we've been hitherto inclined to overlook. But yeah, again, I think the fact that these terms help us call people out is kind of all to the good.
Okay, and we've got some questions appearing in the Ask a Question
Great.
function, so keep them coming, and I'll come to those in a minute. But I wanted to sort of perhaps, at the risk of raising the temperature, go into some of the more controversial areas that you talk about in the book. Your discussion of abortion is an interesting one, and I think, is it fair to say that you really do think the abortion debate comes down to a question of entitlement for a woman to control her own body and fertility, and that actually, therefore, when people say it's about murder rights of the fetus, that's a kind of distraction. That's not actually what's going on. Is that a fair summary of what you say? And if so, why?
Yeah, I might put it slightly differently. I would say I have a lot of time for debunking arguments in philosophy, which say, look, when we're talking about some phenomenon X, what we're really talking about is due to these social forces, or we're interested in X because of these social forces when we're not interested in analogous phenomena. And I'm pretty much saying that about the abortion debate. This was something which was a very minor issue for most people, including Christians, with the exception of Catholics, during most of the 20th century, up until the time when political campaigners decided it would be a good issue to get white Southerners, particularly racist white Southerners, who were already alienated by desegregation. They decided that that would be a good way to get people on board with voting Republican against their economic interests. And it was very explicit. It's been written about in, you know, the New York Times in '72, for example, by Kevin Phillips, saying, like, let's design this strategy to get, you know, Nixon initially elected in '72, prior to Roe, prior to this being a big issue. This was an AstroTurf campaign, not a grassroots initiative. And so the gradual social invention of the fetus as a person, now that doesn't establish philosophically that they didn't hit upon a deep truth accidentally. But I think it would be a big coincidence if they managed to hit upon this very politically convenient and, frankly, this kind of malevolent plan to force people's moral hand to make them vote Republican, despite their economic interests lying with Democrats. Be a big coincidence if that happened to coincide with some deep philosophical truth that we'd hitherto missed in human history. I mean, it's possible, but it would be amazing.
But even if that's true as a kind of story about why this debate has taken on the political importance it's had and how it's come to operate that role, I guess now that genie is out of the bottle, and now the issue is there of the, you know, whether or not the killing of a fetus is a form of murder. Is it really possible to, where we are now, fight that debate without addressing that head on? Because it sounds a bit like you think by addressing that head on, we're fighting the war on the wrong grounds.
I do think that. I think philosophers have traditionally made a mistake of taking various premises that essentially are supplied by conservatives and Republican strategists and seeing what follows and arguing about whether it follows that this is indeed murder. I think we really need to, you know, back up the cart many, many steps and say, what is this issue really about genealogically? And give a kind of rich sense of where it came from. I think that can be more edifying than agreeing to a complete decontextualization of this as a social issue in ways that I think analytic ethicists have traditionally been comfortable with.
Another issue which comes up, it's not central to the book, but it does come up in various points, is the debate over trans rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want you to help us out on this, really, because I think that a lot of people are look at this debate from the outside and are somewhat confused by this, that seems to be a disagreement about essentially whether you're male or female is entirely for you to determine for yourself, and that whether or not there are additional biological facts which are relevant to making that decision. And it seems that people who take the view that it isn't simply a matter of self-determination are given this label of transphobic. And I'd like to sort of understand a bit more about why that is the case, because it seems from the outside that this is a reasonable disagreement that people might have, which isn't based on deep prejudice. A lot of people who have the view that biology has something to do with it are themselves feminists who have been on the right side of all the good sort of liberal debates over history, and they now find themselves with this transphobic label. Can you help me explain why that's come about? And I mean, do you entirely agree that transphobic is the right word to use in that context?
Yeah, I do. And I would link it to the idea that misogyny isn't about intention, it's about impact. It's not about what people feel in their hearts. It's not about saying that people are hate-filled individuals. I don't think it matters much if someone is a hate-filled individual with respect to trans persons. What I think matters is whether they're contributing to an environment in which trans people face systematic hostility, hatred, and barriers to living a good life simply because they're trans. So I think transphobia is the appropriate label for those who challenge someone's entitlement to tell us who they are. I mean, that is such a fundamental human entitlement. And, you know, in many, many other analogous areas that are even less important, it would be bizarre if I said, Jillian, I've decided to go by Katie rather than Kate recently. Would you mind adjusting your usage accordingly? It would be really bizarre if you pushed back against that. And yet trans people telling us, look, this is my gender, these are my pronouns, this is who I am in some deep sense, that it's deeply entwined with their ability to live a good and authentic life. I think it's so strange to not grant that basic entitlement and to recognize trans people for who they are.
I mean, but going back to the comparison with the term misogynist, that there's misogyny, but you only call it a misogynist is a term you reserve for the overachievers, as you put it, the person who is over and above beyond that. I suppose my concern would be that there may be a person who wants to respect the change of name, want to use their preferred pronouns, all these things, and yet they have a certain view that there are certain contexts in which the physiology, the biology does matter. And it's a very specific, narrow thing in a way. Now, isn't that person doesn't seem obviously to be an overachiever in terms of right? So
it's not exact. I mean, so I would defer to trans philosophers on this. If you were thinking of a strict analogy, you might comfortably call someone who was had the views that you described transphobic, but you might not call them a transphobe. But that could be a distinction without a difference. And I certainly don't think I'm the person who, as a cis woman, should get to define these concepts. It's really just a suggestion of an analogy that focuses our attention not on intention and someone perhaps, you know, who knows what they feel, who cares what they feel. The fact is they're making life hard for trans people in a world that is systematically set against them.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I don't want to spend time on that. As you say, you're a cis woman, I'm a cis man, and really we want to have this debate perhaps in the future sometime in the Festival Ideas with people who are closer to the front line of this. There are some questions coming in. The top question isn't really a question, it's a comment, but I think we should mention it because it's got some support from people. Really basically liking the fact that you're approving the fact that you are challenging the idea that most abusers were abused themselves by pointing out the fact that most abusers are male and most abused are female. So in a sense, you can tell simply from that fact that it can't be the case that most abused become abusers. There is a question here. I think I need to read it out, or you can look at it yourself actually by popping up. In the book, you do talk about involuntary celibates, these incels. These are men who really feel like they are entitled to sex. They're not getting it, and they become very nasty, sometimes violent, sometimes extremely violent in response. And the person says there's a big difference in the observed behavior between men and women who happen to be celibate. Those men express their frustration in violent, unwarranted ways. Well, some of those men, I should point out. There are celibate priests and monks and everything. You proposed that the reason behind this behavior stems from the patriarchal system. And the question is whether the difference could be linked to biology, to testosterone. How did you rule out that hypothesis for your book entitled? And I suppose perhaps there's a more general question here. It's true to say that you don't really spend much time talking about potential biological explanations for all sorts of differences between men and women. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, right. I mean, I talk about this somewhat in my first book. Part of what I'm showing is how differently men and women are socialized as boys and girls. Again, not to exclude, but there's less data that I'm aware of on non-binary kids. And when you bear in mind those huge differences in socialization, it turns out not to be very mysterious that some boys grow up to have a sense of male entitlement to sex, most obviously, but still more insidiously, things like love and care and admiration. And so one way to put it is you just don't need to invoke a potential biological explanation to explain why it's men rather than women who are now, who identify as incels, that is involuntary celibates, who regard themselves not just as disappointed by a lack of love in their life, but as fundamentally having been screwed over, as entitled to something that they're not being given. And of course, you know, some sort of biological explanation could still be true. I'm really skeptical, but there's no way we could know that it's true for, you know, for the duration of these patriarchal forces, because they muddy the waters so much. And it turns out they also happen to explain what needs to be explained here, namely vast gender differences in who identifies as an incel, who regards themselves not just as disappointed by loneliness, but as aggrieved and resentful on that basis. So that's why I take the approach I do, because these differences are both surplus to explanatory requirements, and because we couldn't possibly know about their influence until we have a control group that is a non-patriarchal world to compare ourselves with now.
That's very interesting. We had Cordelia Fine at the festival a few years ago, and her work on this is really very interesting. And what was striking there was in the audience how there's some real resistance from people, just, almost like, of course the biological difference is a huge thing. How could you possibly think otherwise? And I think we had a bit of mansplaining there from someone who studied a lot less biology than Cordelia Fine, that she must have been wrong. We have a question here about, the first question was from AM, so no name there, but this is from Candia Carolan. I hope I got pronounced that correctly. How does entitlement contribute to the Paula principle, which is how and why women work below their level of competence? First of all, perhaps you should say whether you think the Paula principle is a real phenomenon or not. And
what's the Paula principle? I actually am totally unfamiliar with that.
Okay, well, exactly. Fortunately, I think it's put in here, is that women working below their level of competence, I think. So it's the idea that, I guess this is this connected to these experiments which show that when you present a maths test to boys and girls, if you ask them to tick a box saying whether they're male or female beforehand, if they tick girl, they perform less than if they don't. That being reminded they're girls makes them underperform in maths, because they're reminded of the stereotype that as they're not so good at it. Is entitlement connected to that, do you think?
Yeah, I really think it is. So study after study shows that when women and men are described in identical ways by giving alternate, by giving the same personnel file to alternate experimental subjects, but labeled either with the name James for a man or the name Andrea for a woman. People, despite having that identical information, judge James to be more competent than Andrea. For 85% of people, both men and women will judge the man to be the more competent of the two. But if you hold fixed levels of competence by telling people that these are both superstars in their field, something really interesting happens. Suddenly, 85% of people judge James to be more likable than Andrea. So they switch the basis for their inchoate sense that he's just better somehow. So on the basis of those kinds of studies, it might make sense that women in certain contexts, I'm sure not all contexts, underperform in certain ways because high degrees of competence in women tend to lead to being disliked and regarded. In particular, you're regarded as interpersonally hostile or aggressive or cold just for being competent. So this pertains mostly to male-dominated areas, but we do tend to judge women very harshly, not in spite of their competence, but precisely because of it. We think that she's kind of not a warm and fuzzy person on this basis.
Right, so we're running towards the end of our time, so I'm sorry if you got your question in late, we may not be able to answer it. But there was a question about sexism in academia. Obviously, historically, some subjects have been seen as more masculine, others more stereotypically feminine. Is that still a problem in 2020?
Yes, it's very much a problem. I think academia, and I can talk about philosophy in most specificity, suffers from a number of problems. One is sexual harassment is a big problem. Some might say it's endemic. We suffer from huge gender gaps in numbers. So I think in the US, something like only 17% of faculty members who are either tenure or tenure track are women. I think that's right. I should double check that, but it's something pretty dismal numbers wise. Philosophy in particular is as bad in terms of proportions gender wise as pretty much any subject in the humanities. It's worse than, and it's on par with only, I think, theology, and I think it might be pure math in terms of other disciplines. And partly because of that, there are still, and this is partly anecdotal, but it's also been studied by people like Sally Haslanger, there are extant forms of discrimination and hostility that are real problems we desperately need to combat.
Yeah, no, I think I know this philosophy is a terrible overachiever when it comes to that. I have to say, just a funny thing I wanted to ask you about. At the end of the book, in the dedication, there's a very, very warm and touching dedication to your husband, Daniel, which, apart from anything, completely nails the typical accusation hurled at someone like you that you're some kind of man hater. Obviously not true. But what was quite interesting was that the last words you say are, "I can only hope to someday go some way towards deserving him," which I thought was, given what your book was about, was a very interesting sentence to end on, because it sounded like you were questioning your entitlement to have the love of this man. Now, obviously, that's something you must have been conscious of in some way.
Right.
Why did you nonetheless feel, I'm going to say that?
Partly deliberate irony and being tongue-in-cheek about it, but partly, as you picked up on, sort of acknowledgement of the fact that I do often feel both extraordinarily blessed, but also maybe a tiny bit guilty about the fact that I have a genuinely, fully both supportive, but also someone who's a completely egalitarian co-parent, which, as various aspects of my book brought out, is extremely rare. And I feel incredibly lucky and privileged, and grateful because of that. And I do often think gosh, what did I do to deserve this? So yeah, I thought I would leave my tongue in my cheek at the end of the book.
Well, look, thank you very much. I think we feel very blessed to have you here today to talk about the book, which can be bought from our partners at Warstones. The link is there. I'm going to completely, I don't know if this is not necessarily Festival Ideas policy, but I'm going to encourage you, if you don't get it from Warstones, at least buy it from a proper bookshop and not from certain online tax dodgers, if you may. I'm sure Kate would agree with that too. Entitled, really interesting read. People use words like provocative and things like that, and I think that's actually probably not the right word, because it makes it sound like Kate's just trying to be provocative for the sake of it. I think the fact is that she deals with a lot of things in the book which are just very, very important and very, very challenging for all of us, not least because, you know, this is a misogynistic world. It's not about our intentions. That's something which has really come through. So thank you very much for that. Plenty more events coming up in the Festival of Ideas. And please come along. As you say, we make these free. You can watch them afterwards. But if nobody pays to turn up, then the future of it will be more dubious. So if you can afford to pay to come to the events, please do. It's wonderful to see people from all over the world coming to these events, and also lots of people from Bristol. So if you're from Bristol, I hope it gives you a little bit of a sense of your city as a vibrant, interesting place. If you're from the rest of the world, I hope it's also given you a sense of Bristol as a vibrant, interesting place. Please come and visit us once such things are both safe and legal. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation, Julian, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm so honored.